Would you please stand for the reading of the gospel? I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. I have received this command from my Father. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Our reading this morning is from 1 John. For this is the message you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We must not be like Cain, who was from the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not be astonished, brothers and sisters, that the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love one another. Whoever does not love abides in death. All who hate a brother or sister are murderers, and you know that murderers do not have eternal life abiding in them. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's good and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? Little children, let us love not in word or speech, but in truth and action. And by this we will know that we are from the truth and will reassure our hearts before him, whenever our hearts condemn us. For our God is greater than our hearts, and he knows everything. Beloved, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have boldness before God, and we receive from him whatever we ask, because we obey his commandments and do what pleases him. And this is his commandment, that we should believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he has commanded us. All who obey his commandments abide in him, and he abides in them. And by this we know that he abides in us, by the Spirit that he has given us. This is the word of the Lord.
You know, when I was a kid, my little brother and I, we would play with our neighborhood friends. We'd do all kinds of things. We'd play baseball or basketball or reenact our favorite movies from the early 80s and 90s, especially the action movies. You should really hear a kid try to imitate Arnold Schwarzenegger's accent. But I remember one sport that my little brother and I tried our hands at that, well, it got us into trouble with our parents and our friends' parents. We started a boxing tournament. Now, before you blame my parents for getting us boxing gloves, I remembered this week that these mischievous Christmas gifts were actually gifts from my older brother. That seemed like something a big brother would do. Well, this boxing got us into big trouble when our friends started going home for supper with bloody noses and black eyes. It was a very short boxing circuit. And all I remember my mom saying, as she shut it down, is that God frowns on you killing your brother. Thou shalt not kill is one of those Christian mandates that we've seemed to do a better job at than some of the others. I mean, I think it's safe to say that nearly all of us, and I'm hoping all of us, have this one down. So it strikes me as a little odd that the author of 1 John, in describing what life as a follower of Jesus looks like, starts here with this obvious command not to murder like Cain did. Of course, if you'll remember the story of Cain and Abel, they were the other brotherly duo who tried to kill each other, except it was really only Cain who tried and succeeded at killing his little brother. In his hatred and his non-love, Cain killed Abel. And it's this question that Cain poses to God when he's confronted with the guilt of his actions. Am I my brother's keeper? And perhaps the most interesting part of this story is that we don't ever get an answer to Cain's question. It just hangs there in the air while he's exiled off away from his family and his home. It's really this question that haunts the narrative of our humanity. Are we our neighbor's keeper? Are we in this for ourselves or for others? Cain took a survival of the fittest approach to answering this question. He achieved and he tried to eliminate the competition. He didn't leave room for much grace. Instead, he was consumed with himself and only left room for envy and competition and hatred. For Cain, the answer was no, I am not. Take a quick look at a history book or a quick survey of the news, and you'll see that we're still struggling with this question today. Or maybe we find ways to work around this moral obligation. Like those nations before us, maybe we try to parse the issue by limiting who our neighbors are. But if we learn anything from this text, if we learn anything from the life and teachings of Jesus, if we learn anything from the Spirit of God at work today, it's that we are all created in God's image, and therefore we are all God's children. And as such, we are each other's neighbors. Am I my neighbor's keeper? If you are a follower of Jesus, then the answer is absolutely. Because while the narrative of humanity has bent toward violence and self-preservation, the arc of God's story has bent towards life and reconciliation. So the words here in 1 John are extremely important for us today. So maybe we know that we are supposed to be our neighbor's keeper. Maybe that's not the question that we need to ask this morning. Maybe what we need to ask is, how do we do that? What does that look like? And that's where our text points us this morning. It lays it out for us. To love your neighbor, to be your neighbor's keeper, you must not take his or her life, and instead you must give life. If you're going to be your neighbor's keeper, for starters, you can't be your neighbor's killer. Again, I think that we probably have this part down pat, right? Except I wonder if we do. Don't read the word murder here as simply a literal death. The real words to focus on are not just life and death, but love and hatred. Because for the author, love equals life and hatred equals death. Cain killed out of the hatred and self-preservation that was in his heart, and it led to his brother's death. And in some ways, we could say that Cain died that day too, forced to live in exile for the rest of his life, isolated, alienated, forgotten. And herein lies the challenge for us as American Christians. Our dominant culture espouses a life of dreams and manifest destiny, that we can have whatever we desire as long as we try hard enough. And it's a lofty sentiment. And in no way am I saying that we shouldn't be grateful for the freedoms that we have. Of course we should. But the challenge for us as Christians here is that we get caught up in that same mindset too sometimes. It's seemingly innocent enough to pursue our dreams and strive after goals, but what tends to happen is that the more we strive and pursue and dream, the more we become consumed with ourselves and furthering our own agendas. And when that happens, when we begin to look more deeply into ourselves, we start to lose sight of those around us, especially those on the margins. And unwittingly, unintentionally, and indifference can creep in for the needs of others. We can develop an apathy for injustice. And before long, these can become symptoms of an atrophy of our faith. We don't set out to kill or to harm anyone, and literally speaking, we aren't killing anyone. But when we become consumed by our desires and our needs to achieve and success and impress, we are much more likely to forget the pain and needs of others. Out of sight, out of mind. And when those who are in need are no longer in our minds, we have shifted into a worldview that can contribute to their alienation and isolation and forgottenness. We must not take life from our neighbors. This reminds me of a scene from one of my favorite movies, Back to the Future. And while I'm mentioning Back to the Future, there are a lot of these 80s movies that have made a comeback, and I'm still holding out hope that Back to the Future will make it back to the future soon. Sorry. But anyway, there's this scene where Marty McFly, he's back in the past, and he's up against the clock, literally a clock tower, and he's trying to make his parents fall in love, and it's this whole complicated science fiction that is too long to get into, but essentially, if they don't fall in love, then it's as if he never existed in the future. And so he has this picture, not this picture, but he has a picture of his family, he and his siblings, and they slowly start to fade away and disappear. And pretty soon, toward the end of the movie, he starts to physically fade and almost disappear. And well, of course, everything works out in the end, and they fall in love, and he and his siblings survive. They have 2 sequels after all, but I think about this text with that in mind, and I can't help wondering if I'm living in such a way that people's lives are starting to fade away as if they never even existed, forgotten on the margins. Am I my neighbor's keeper, or am I keeping life from her? Just like we must not take life, this text goes on to tell us that we must give life. And we give life by giving our own. We must die to our self-absorbed ways of life, our narcissistic tendencies, this way of seeing the world that misses those in need. When we lay down our lives, we begin to consider the lives and stories of others and not just our own. When we lay down our lives, we make time to enter into relationships with people who are different than us and discover that we learn more about God when we see God in others. When we lay down our lives, we embody a love and generosity that reaches beyond ourselves to those in need. It's not that dissimilar from what our Stephen ministers do as they give up time and energy to sit and be with those in need. It's also paradoxical, really. We lay down our lives to give life to others. Yet, in the process of dying to ourselves, we find real life. It's the way of Christ. It's the way of resurrection. This week, the residents, we went to the DMA, the Dallas Museum of Art, with our very own Mike Hill. And we had a little session, kind of a private session, where we went through and saw an exhibit of Mikhail Bormann's artwork. And we're discussing art and some of his paintings, and we get to this one, and it's these 2 boys that are sort of holding on to this dead rabbit, and they're just looking over it, and that's all the painting is. And so it's a little jarring at first, a little disconcerting maybe even, but we got talking about it. And this idea came up that in some ways this rabbit actually lived on lived again in this recreation and this retelling of its life in this painting on this canvas. It was given a new life in the recreated and retold story. When we begin to see others and not just ourselves, when we remember them and advocate for them and empower them to do the same, then we begin to recreate and retell their stories, and we begin to breathe life into theirs. By standing in solidarity with those in exile of poverty or racial discrimination or gender inequality or religious oppression or any other sort of exile we discover along the way, we might get messy. And we might even come out bearing a few wounds ourselves. But these wounds of solidarity are marks that announce new life. We keep our neighbors when we keep them among us, in body and in mind. The part of the story you might not remember very well about Cain is that after he's cast out, he feared for his life. And so there's this beautiful moment of mercy that comes forth from God. From that point forward, God protects Cain from being killed by giving him a mark, and we know it as the mark of Cain. It signified to others not to kill him because he was God's. So often we see that mark as a stigma, and I'm sure it was in some ways. Cain bore on himself a scar, a mark that every time he saw it, he was reminded of the story of Abel, of a life taken too soon. And yet, from that mark, from that wound, from that scar, Cain found life, God's grace of a new beginning. There's an author, his name is Shane Claiborne, and he wrote a book called Irresistible Revolution. And in it, he recounts a story of when he was in Calcutta, India with Mother Teresa. He was there for a summer working alongside her. Now, he said that people would ask him when he came back, what was she like? Did she glow in the dark? Did she have a halo? He said what he remembered was that she was short and precious, and maybe even a little ornery, sort of like a beautiful, wise granny, he says. But he adds that there's one thing that he would never forget, and that was that her feet were deformed. He said it was almost as if she had had leprosy herself. One day, he learned the story from one of the sisters. She said that they get just enough shoes for everyone, and so Mother didn't want anyone to get the worst pair. So she would dig through and find that pair. And it was years of wearing bad pairs of shoes that had deformed her feet. That is laying down your life for your neighbor. She kept sight of those on the margins by joining them on the margins, and in keeping them close, she was her neighbor's keeper. And in laying down her life, she bore the scars and the wounds and the marks that announced that she was right there with them, that she was bringing new life. So I ask you this morning, where are your scars, your wounds, your marks that retell the stories of those you're standing in solidarity with? Those voices you've heard and the stories you've told, those lives you've tried to empower to live an abundant life. If you are your neighbor's keeper, then you too are carrying burdens and bearing scars and wounds and marks and stories that signal that you are with them, that announce that you are bringing life by dying to your own. In this season of Easter, we proclaim the good news that Christ is alive, and so are we. Not alive to ourselves, but alive to the way of Christ, and that way is a way of light and a way of love. A love that doesn't take life, but a love that gives life. A love that doesn't exclude our neighbors or force them out, but a love that keeps them and keeps them close. Am I my neighbor's keeper? Yes. But as you leave here, will you ask yourself the daring question, am I being my neighbor's keeper? Amen.